I was brushing my teeth when my wife screamed from the driveway like she'd found a live rattlesnake in the glove box. I ran outside in pajamas, toothbrush still foaming, and there it was. A tow truck was backing up slowly toward her Jeep. Not parked illegally. Not in the wrong spot. Just sitting pretty in our own driveway and on our property. And standing next to the tow truck was Karen, our HOA president, wearing a reflective vest, waving a clipboard like a traffic wand, and shouting into her phone. Leah was blocking the driver, shouting, "This is my car. What are you doing?" Karen looked straight at me and said, "It's being repossessed per HOA Article 7. Repossessed? I almost choked on minty foam. Not towed. Not ticketed. Repossessed. I was stunned speechless for a moment. Because what Karen didn't know, what made this moment so spectacularly idiotic, was that we still owned that Jeep. As in, it was technically in inventory. Because my wife and I owned the dealership it came from. Leah's eyes were blazing, but she had enough composure to wave her phone toward the truck driver, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This is private property. That vehicle belongs to us. You touch it, I swear I will sue your company for every bolt on that rust bucket." The tow driver hesitated. Karen waved her clipboard. "Proceed with the order. It's illegal under HOA guidelines." The driver looked between them, clearly realizing he had stepped into the middle of a suburban battlefield he hadn't signed up for. Meanwhile, I was trying not to laugh and scream at the same time. I didn't want to blow our cover too soon. Karen was the kind of person who thought authority came from volume and clipboard. I knew from past experience she never actually read the laws she weaponized. And that made what was coming even more beautiful. Just 24 hours earlier, Leah had decided to rotate one of our promotional vehicles from the dealership inventory. She'd picked a new Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, black on black with massive tires and premium tint. Technically, it was still part of dealership stock, just registered under our executive demo program, which gave us full legal ownership until final sale. So when Karen slapped a violation sticker on it that morning, claiming it violated neighborhood rules about modifications, Leah had laughed it off. But now? Karen had gone full psycho and called in a third-party tow company claiming it was an unauthorized vehicle. Leah tried to explain, calmly at first, that the HOA didn't have jurisdiction over vehicles parked on the owner's driveway when the property line clearly extended past the sidewalk. Karen responded by threatening to file a lien if we didn't remove it. A lien. On our own house. Because of our own Jeep. What she didn't expect was that we were already prepared. This wasn't our first Karen rodeo. For months now, Karen had harassed us over everything from mailbox size to the shade of mulch Leah used in the flower bed. But this was beyond the pale. I grabbed my phone and called our dealership manager, Dave, who just happened to be in town and had a flair for theatrics. I told him to bring the title folder, a press kit, and the 7-foot promotional Jeep balloon we usually put on rooftops for events. If Karen wanted a show, we'd give her a grand opening. While waiting, I tried to buy time with the tow driver, who was now clearly regretting his morning route. I offered him a donut and asked if he wanted to look at the registration. He glanced at Karen, who was now mid-call with someone she claimed was the regional compliance officer. Probably just her friend Barb from book club. I pulled him aside and said softly, "That Jeep belongs to the dealership. It's on executive inventory. If you touch it, that's felony theft." He blinked. "Dealership?" I nodded. "I own the dealership. That Jeep's mine. Her name's not on any paperwork." His eyes widened and he took 2 big steps back. Karen noticed and stomped over. She was furious that her power play was dissolving. "You have no authority here," she snapped at me. "This is an HOA matter. It's non-compliant. Oversized wheels, window tint, custom decals. It looks like a gangster vehicle. My neighbors have rights." I almost laughed out loud. A gangster vehicle? That Jeep was cleaner than a surgical table and newer than her acrylic nails. But I just smiled and said, "Actually, that's a promotional unit. It's on loan from our showroom. We own 7 like it. She looked confused, then annoyed, then dismissive. You're bluffing. And then Dave arrived. In his oversized Ram, dealership tags, full suit, sunglasses, and a huge cardboard box. He stepped out like a lawyer entering court. Morning, folks. He handed Karen a folder. Here's the title. Legal proof of ownership. VIN matches. Registered to our dealership. And here's a cease and desist letter from our legal department. If you try to remove this vehicle again, you'll be charged with attempted theft and HOA overreach. Karen stood there, blinking. Dave continued, also, for our records, I've brought a promotional banner. He opened the box and pulled out a massive sign that read, Meet our newest off-road star, available now at Briarwood Motors. With a cartoon Jeep flying over a mountain and Leah's name on a tag labeled Executive Demo. Leah burst out laughing. The tow truck driver gave a thumbs up and started packing up. Karen sputtered something about unauthorized advertising and stormed back to her house, fuming like a toddler who lost her juice box. But the battle wasn't over. As Dave packed up, he looked at me and said, You know she's going to try something worse now, right? I nodded. This was just her opening shot. Karen never accepted public humiliation quietly. And the Jeep episode would only light a bigger fire. But this time we had a plan. That night, as Leah and I sat on the porch sipping coffee, we brainstormed the next step. We both knew Karen wouldn't stop until she had either our Jeep removed or our names blacklisted from the HOA. She'd dig into bylaws, invent violations, and harass us through official channels. But she didn't know we'd been collecting evidence. Photos, emails, security footage, HOA board recordings, and one former board member who had recently hinted that Karen had some skeletons in her garage. As the sun went down and the Jeep sparkled in the driveway, I turned to Leah and said, She thinks this is about the Jeep. But she has no idea what she just triggered. And just like that, the war began. Not over a car, but over power, entitlement, and the illusion of control. Karen picked the wrong family to mess with. And soon enough, the entire neighborhood would know why. The morning after the tow truck incident, the neighborhood was buzzing. Leah and I couldn't take a walk without getting stopped by someone asking, Did she really try to repossess your Jeep? Or, I heard she called it gang-affiliated. Is that true? Word had spread fast, and Karen's brazen stunt had officially crossed the HOA gossip threshold into legendary status. But the real problem wasn't what she'd done, it was what she was planning next. Karen wasn't the type to retreat in embarrassment. No, she was regrouping, rewriting the narrative, and preparing to come back with a vengeance wrapped in a policy manual. We didn't have to wait long. That same afternoon, a letter was taped to our front door in an envelope marked with the HOA seal. Leah peeled it open and read it aloud with theatrical flair. The letter was an official notice of noncompliance, citing violations under Section 9 of the HOA guidelines. Alleged infractions included vehicle aesthetics inconsistent with community standards, potential commercial use of property, and unregistered business activity. I rolled my eyes so hard I almost sprained something. Karen had shifted from vehicle harassment to accusing us of running a dealership from our driveway. That accusation wasn't just ridiculous, it was deliberate. Karen knew the law enough to dance near the edge. If she could convince the board that we were conducting business on residential property, she might trigger zoning issues or even fines from the city. Leah handed me the letter with an exasperated snort and said, She really thinks she's dealing with amateurs. We sat down that night and began building a timeline. Every incident, every email, every note from Karen, organized and logged. It wasn't just about defending ourselves anymore. We were preparing for a full-scale counteroffensive. The next day, I decided it was time to dig into the HOA's meeting records. Karen had been president for nearly 3 years, and her reign was marked by sudden rule changes, unexplained fees, and an uncanny ability to make people feel like rule breakers for existing. I filed a formal request to view the HOA meeting minute. Per state law, as a homeowner, I had the right to access any non-confidential board proceedings. Karen tried to stall me, of course. She replied via email that she'd get to it in 2 to 3 weeks due to backlog. That made me laugh. Backlog? There were only 57 homes in our development, and I knew for a fact the board met monthly with no more than 6 attendees, half of whom were Karen's poker friends. When I finally got the documents, thanks to a polite but firm letter from our attorney, they confirmed what I suspected. In the last year alone, Karen had pushed through a series of amendments to the HOA handbook under the vague label Community Enhancement Clauses. These amendments gave the HOA the power to issue aesthetic warnings, approve or deny driveway usage beyond 3 parked vehicles, and impose temporary usage restrictions for non-standard vehicle appearances. Basically, it was a series of Karen-written loopholes that allowed her to harass people under the guise of policy. The most outrageous discovery was that these rules had passed via emergency board votes, which Karen had signed off herself without full board approval. At least 3 of the members were missing from every single vote. I double-checked the board roster and noticed something else strange. 2 of the listed members had moved out of the neighborhood months ago. Their names were still being used to validate quorum. I cross-referenced public records and confirmed both houses had new owners. Karen had been forging compliance with outdated member signatures. Leah and I decided to visit one of the former board members, a woman named Jill, who now lived a few miles away in a nearby subdivision. We brought over coffee and explained what we'd uncovered. Jill wasn't surprised. In fact, she seemed relieved. She told us that Karen had pressured her to sign blank forms during her final weeks on the board, supposedly to help speed up minor rule clarifications. Jill admitted she'd been uncomfortable with Karen's tactics for years, especially her alliance with a local mechanic who conveniently towed every so-called non-compliant vehicle to his own shop and charged outrageous storage fees before release. Jill had even heard whispers of Karen receiving cash gifts or discounts in exchange for the referrals. That mechanic's name rang a bell. I remembered seeing it on the side of the tow truck from a few days earlier. It was a little mom-and-pop garage on the edge of town called Kenny's Auto Recovery, a place that should have been barely scraping by on jump starts and fender repairs, but somehow always had a shiny new truck parked out front. We decided to pay Kenny a visit, just to observe. When we pulled into the gravel lot, I immediately spotted something off. Parked behind the shop in a fenced yard were at least 8 vehicles, some with HOA stickers still on the windows. A few had visible damage from being improperly towed. One was an old classic Mustang, another a modified Bronco, and the rest were a mix of trucks and SUVs with off-road tires, similar to Leah's Jeep. I walked into the office and pretended to be a customer. Kenny, a pudgy man with greasy hands and a ratty cap, greeted me without enthusiasm. I told him my cousin's car got tagged by his HOA and he was worried about it being towed. Without missing a beat, Kenny said, "Tell him to keep it off the street. I know the lady who runs that place. She's strict." I played dumb and asked if he worked with HOAs a lot. Kenny nodded proudly. "Got an exclusive hookup with Briarview Estate. Lady President's real sharp. Sends 'em my way when needed." That was all I needed to hear. He'd just confessed to an unofficial arrangement with Karen. I thanked him, left, and returned to the car, where Leah had been covertly recording the audio through the open Bluetooth channel. She smiled when I got in. "Got it all," she said. He even bragged about towing that old Bronco from Lot 16. That's Brent's place. Brent was another neighbor who'd complained about Karen's constant harassment. He'd been mysteriously fined twice in 1 month for non-uniform paint, even though his house looked identical to half the neighborhood. We now had a potential pattern. Karen was selectively targeting homeowners with expensive or customized vehicles, issuing warnings under her phony HOA amendments, and having them towed to Kenny's garage, where they'd either pay hefty fees or risk permanent loss. Kenny profited. Karen probably got kickbacks, and no one had challenged it, until now. With audio recordings, HOA minutes, legal documents, and first-hand statements, our case was becoming airtight. Back at home, we laid out all the evidence across the kitchen table. Leah stared at the mountain of proof and said, "She thinks this is about aesthetics. But this is fraud. This is theft with paperwork." I nodded slowly. We weren't just going to clear our names, we were about to blow the roof off her entire little operation. And we were going to do it publicly, legally, and with enough flair to make sure she never forgot the day she tried to mess with the people who owned the very Jeep she tried to steal. Karen wasn't just out of her depth now. She was drowning in a sea of her own arrogance. And she didn't even know the tide was rising. By the time the weekend rolled around, the air in the neighborhood felt heavier. Karen's blinds remained shut, which for someone who usually peeked out every 10 minutes like a hawk in yoga pants, was uncharacteristic. Leah and I weren't surprised. Our quiet collection of evidence had turned into a full-scale dossier thicker than most HOA handbook. We had the HOA meeting minutes with questionable signatures, audio from Kenny practically admitting to a shady deal, a list of wrongly towed vehicles, and a line of neighbors slowly growing bold enough to speak up. Still, we needed to make our next move count. And that meant striking not just with facts but with strategy. Because Karen wasn't just a bad neighbor. She was running a racket, one that weaponized a community's trust for personal gain. Leah and I sat at our dealership's conference table Monday morning, sipping coffee while going over every page of documentation. Dave, our general manager, had joined us with a laptop, giving the situation his full attention. The dealership wasn't just a business to us, it was family legacy. Leah's father had built it from the ground up, and we were fiercely protective of anything attached to our name, especially something as petty and unjust as what Karen had tried to pull. Dave leaned back in his chair and said, "I think it's time we throw her off her game. Let's hit her where she's not looking, public perception." He was right. Karen had built her HOA power on the illusion of respectability. She projected authority with that smug smirk, a clipboard, and an air of superiority that most people never challenged. But that was about to change. We launched the first phase that afternoon. The dealership issued a press release. Not naming names, of course, about a disturbing incident involving an HOA attempting to wrongfully seize dealership-owned inventory from private property. It included details about improper towing practices, non-compliant HOA amendments, and a call to all residents to double-check their rights under state property laws. We attached a photo of the promotional Jeep, minus license plate, with the tagline, "Know who owns what before you tow." The press release got picked up by a local autoblogger, and from there, a community radio host invited me to give a 5-minute interview on the topic. I kept things neutral, but I emphasized the dangers of power-hungry HOAs overstepping legal boundaries and what it meant for residents' rights. The community noticed. At the grocery store, I overheard people talking about it near the frozen peas. At the school drop-off, 2 dads in front of me chuckled about that Jeep lady. And slowly but surely, the fear that Karen had carefully instilled over the years began to erode. Because people weren't just hearing about her abuses, they were seeing her exposed. Back at the dealership, we prepared our legal angle. Dave printed copies of the Jeep's title documents, insurance registration, and corporate ownership status. We then reached out to our legal team to draft an official complaint against the HOA, naming Karen and citing her direct interference in private property without due process. What gave our case teeth was the dealership registration. Technically, Karen had attempted to remove corporate inventory from residential land, which escalated the matter to commercial interference. Our lawyers called it a dream case, but for us it was personal. Meanwhile, Karen was scrambling. A neighbor named Todd, who had always been neutral, showed us a flyer she had left on his porch. It read "Neighborhood in Danger. Commercial operations spreading. HOA guidelines must be respected," with no specifics, just vague fear-mongering. It was clearly a panic move, designed to turn the spotlight away from her and onto us. But Todd just shrugged and said, "You guys are the only ones who plow your sidewalk in winter and host the summer barbecue. I trust you more than some note in Comic Sans." Still, Karen wasn't giving up. She organized a special HOA assembly to be held at the community clubhouse the following Saturday. It was supposed to be a forum to address neighborhood violations, but we knew it was going to be a full-blown kangaroo court with us in the crosshairs. Leah smiled when she saw the announcement taped to the mailbox. "She thinks we're going to walk in scared," she said. "She has no idea we're bringing reinforcements." And bring them we did. Saturday arrived, and Leah and I showed up to the clubhouse early, accompanied by Dave, our attorney, and a USB stick full of documentation, timestamps, recordings, and one high-resolution scan of Karen's forged board signatures. Karen was already there, pacing in front of a projector and going through slides labeled Community Standards Enforcement and Danger of Noncompliance. She looked up and stiffened when she saw us walk in with our team. One by one, neighbors trickled in, some curious, some skeptical, most just craving drama on a weekend. Karen opened the meeting with fake warmth, welcoming everyone and thanking them for taking the time to help uphold the dignity of our beautiful community. She then began clicking through her presentation, which included a close-up photo of our Jeep, and statements like over-commercialization of residential spaces and preserving suburban integrity. That's when our lawyer stood up and asked politely for a moment of rebuttal. Karen refused. "This isn't a legal proceeding," she snapped. "This is a neighborhood conversation." But the room shifted. Someone from the back said, "Then why'd you call it an assembly and send official notices?" She faltered for a second, then pressed on. But our lawyer didn't back down. He held up the printed vehicle title and said, "The vehicle in question is corporate property. Your attempted removal constitutes interference with commercial assets on private land. That's not just overreach, that's potentially criminal." Gasps went up. Karen's composure began to fray. "They're twisting everything," she cried. "They're running a dealership out of their home." But Dave stood up and said, "Actually, we're not. But even if we were, that wouldn't justify your forgery." He handed out packets to the audience containing HOA meeting minutes with missing signatures and highlighted dates that contradicted Karen's claims. The former board member, Jill, stood and addressed the room, revealing how Karen had pressured her into signing blank forms and bypassed proper vote. At that point, it was over. The room turned. Even Karen's usual allies looked uncomfortable. One older couple stood up and asked how many other people had their vehicles unfairly towed. 3 hands went up. Then 5. Then a woman tearfully described how her son's truck was towed days before he left for college, costing them nearly $1,000 in fees. Kenny's garage was mentioned. So was the phrase kickbacks. Karen backed up against the podium like it might shield her from the truth. The attorney then calmly stated that a formal complaint had been submitted to the county regarding misuse of HOA funds, illegal rule amendments, and suspected fraud. He also confirmed that if further retaliation occurred, additional civil and criminal charges would be pursued. Karen muttered something about legal harassment and stormed out the side door, leaving behind her half-finished slideshow and the wreckage of her authority. The rest of the meeting morphed into something unexpected. The neighbors began talking, really talking, for the first time in years without the fear of HOA retaliation. They shared stories, frustrations, even jokes about Karen's legendary yardstick she used to measure grass height. Someone suggested forming a temporary board until a new election could be held. Leah was nominated by 3 different people before she even opened her mouth. And I couldn't help but laugh. The woman who had once been threatened over a Jeep was now being asked to lead the very HOA that tried to bulldoze her dignity. As we left the clubhouse that evening, the sky glowing in soft orange light, Leah looked at the Jeep and said, "We should name her." I smiled and said, "I think she's already earned it." We settled on Justice, because it wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about fighting back against people who think power gives them the right to trample others. And thanks to a clipboard-happy Karen and one very persistent wife, our little community had just been reminded what real leadership looks like. Karen might have stormed out of the HOA meeting, but the storm she left behind was only beginning. Her exit was supposed to be a show of indignation, but the reality was that it was her retreat. The neighbors had seen the truth in broad daylight, laid out on projector screens and printed packets, spoken aloud by witnesses who'd stayed quiet far too long. Her grip over the neighborhood, once ironclad through fear and passive-aggressive fines, had cracked. But Leah and I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Karen wasn't the type to disappear quietly. She would lick her wounds, regroup, and come back with whatever leverage she had left, louder, sneakier, and far more desperate. True to form, it only took 2 days for her next move. A certified letter arrived addressed to Leah. The envelope bore the HOA logo, but the return address wasn't the usual P.O. box. It was a private law office downtown. Leah opened it with a calm I envied, unfolding the neatly typed contents and scanning them line by line. Her expression never changed, but when she passed the letter to me, her eyes glittered with something between rage and amusement. Karen had hired a private attorney, and was now alleging that Leah's Jeep had violated zoning ordinances by visibly advertising a commercial entity on residential property. She claimed the Jeep's dealership tag and small sticker in the rear window, which read Briarwood Motors Executive Loaner, constituted unlawful signage. In a neighborhood, she insisted, that did not permit commercial display, the Jeep was essentially an unauthorized billboard. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but Leah didn't smile. She just shook her head and said, "She's trying to bleed us with bureaucracy. One letter at a time." I knew exactly what she meant. Karen had realized she couldn't win by force, so she was pivoting to legal attrition, hoping we'd get tired, spend money, and eventually give up. But Karen had miscalculated again. She thought we were just car people. She didn't know Leah had a minor in law and a stubborn streak forged in courtroom steel thanks to years spent helping her father settle dealership disputes across 3 counties. Leah drafted a response with surgical precision. We denied all allegations and provided statutes clearly stating that as long as a vehicle was legally registered and parked on private property, any incidental branding fell under personal freedom of expression. We also attached state legal precedent and cited 2 prior HOA cases where attempts to limit vehicle-based branding were struck down. Leah ended the letter with a sentence that made me proud. Any continued harassment will be treated as malicious abuse of process, and legal damages will be sought accordingly. But we didn't stop there. Karen had opened the legal floodgates, and we had more than enough evidence to respond in kind. We filed a formal complaint with the Department of Community Affairs, attaching all our collected documents, meeting recordings, and affidavit. The complaint included misuse of authority, fraudulent amendment of HOA bylaws, possible collusion with a third-party towing company, and financial mismanagement of dues. It was the kind of report that would trigger an audit and likely strip Karen of any remaining authority. And just when it seemed like we'd reached the height of the chaos, fate tossed in one more twist. A neighbor we barely knew, Mr. Alvarez, a quiet man who'd lived in the corner house with a perfectly trimmed bonsai garden, showed up at our door holding a plastic tote full of papers. He explained that he used to be the HOA treasurer 2 years ago but left after a disagreement with Karen. He'd kept records, unsure if he'd ever need them. Now, seeing what was happening, he figured the time had come. We took the tote inside, and what we found inside nearly made Leah drop her coffee. Among the folders were bank statements, check copies, and HOA reimbursement requests, signed by Karen for expenses that made no sense. There were payments marked Beautification Project that aligned with the exact dates her backyard landscaping had been redone. Another charge labeled Sign Replacement matched a delivery receipt from a company that specialized in decorative home plaques, one of which we'd seen hanging above her garage. There was even a reimbursement for a vehicle operations consultation from 3 months ago, which aligned perfectly with her first attempt to tow our Jeep. In plain words, Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for her own upgrades and her crusade against us. Leah meticulously scanned everything into digital files and sent it to our attorney, who practically salivated at the potential charges. Embezzlement, misuse of HOA funds, fraud. This wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. This was criminal territory. The legal letter that followed was concise and direct. We informed Karen that we had obtained financial records indicating clear misconduct and that we were preparing a civil suit. We offered one and only one alternative: full resignation from the HOA board, repayment of misappropriated funds, and a written apology to the community. She had 72 hours to respond. During those 3 days, the neighborhood held its breath. Karen's house was unusually quiet, her porch barren, her car absent. On the second night, someone anonymously posted on the community Facebook group asking if it was true that the HOA president had been stealing money. Within hours, the comments exploded. Brent, the guy whose Bronco had been towed, came forward with screenshots of Karen's emails to him. Another neighbor uploaded a photo of her SUV getting pulled by Kenny's tow truck with a caption that read, "Guess who signed off?" It wasn't just a few voices anymore. It was the entire community. On the third morning, an envelope arrived by courier. It was a resignation letter, typed and signed by Karen. No apology, no explanation, just a clinical withdrawal from all HOA activities, effective immediately. She blamed stress, misinformation, and a toxic campaign of character assassination. The irony was almost poetic. Karen had built her entire identity on controlling the narrative, and now she was forced out by the very community she used to bully into silence. The neighborhood held an emergency meeting the following week, this time without theatrics. No power plays, no clipboards. Just residents who wanted peace. The interim board voted to launch an internal audit of all HOA finances. Leah was officially elected to the board by unanimous vote, and within days she introduced new rules mandating financial transparency, public board votes, and term limit. The same people who once cowered at Karen's glare were now voicing suggestions, shaking hands, and waving hello to one another. That night, Leah and I parked the Jeep, Justice, right in the middle of the cul-de-sac for a celebratory photo. Neighbors joined us with snacks, drinks, and more than a few Karen stories. Dave even brought the inflatable Jeep balloon from the dealership and tied it to a mailbox just for fun. Someone played music, and someone else suggested making it an annual event. We called it Jeep Night. It was silly, it was spontaneous, and it felt like everything Karen had tried to suppress was finally bursting free. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting a warm orange over the peaceful street, Leah leaned against the Jeep and said, "She tried to take this from us. Not just the car. The peace. The joy." I nodded, watching neighbors laugh and chat and swap stories. "And now she can't take anything," I replied. "Not even our parking spot." Because it was never about the Jeep. It was about the principle. About standing up to the person who thought power meant control. And now that power had changed hands. Not with force, but with unity, truth, and one very determined executive demo on oversized tires. 3 weeks after Karen's resignation, the neighborhood felt transformed. There was a distinct calm that had been absent for years, like a tense wire had finally snapped and released everyone from its grip. Front lawns were a little more relaxed. Kids played in driveways without being glared at. Neighbors actually spoke to one another instead of sneaking inside at the first sight of a clipboard. And there, parked proudly in our driveway like a trophy of war, sat the same Jeep Karen had once tried to repossess. Still spotless. Still bold. Still technically ours under the dealership's corporate account. The difference now was no one dared challenge it. Leah had wasted no time in her new HOA position. Her first act was to initiate a full forensic audit of all HOA financials for the past 3 years. With the help of Mr. Alvarez and a local CPA, They dug into every receipt, reimbursement, and expense authorization that had passed through Karen's hands. What they found confirmed what we already knew, and uncovered even more. Karen had not only used HOA money for her landscaping and personal signage, but she'd also funneled small payments into fake vendor accounts, including one named K Green Compliance Consulting, which just so happened to share a P.O. box with her nephew's defunct LLC. The audit triggered a secondary investigation by the county's housing authority, who had received our earlier complaint and now had enough evidence to open a formal probe into financial misconduct. Karen was served notice again, this time by someone with a badge and a file folder labeled Civil Liability Inquiry. She was officially being investigated for embezzlement, with a secondary possibility of wire fraud depending on how the funds were moved between accounts. Leah didn't smile at the news. She just said, "It was never personal." She made it personal. And that, more than anything, defined the quiet power Leah now held. We decided to take things a step further, not for revenge, but for community healing. Our dealership launched a new campaign titled Drive with Dignity, offering discounts to residents from neighborhoods with overreaching HOAs who could show documentation of unfair fines, citations, or towing attempts. We thought it would be a small goodwill project. We were wrong. The campaign went viral. Within 5 days, the story was picked up by a regional news station. Their headline read, "Jeep Owners Fight Back. Dealership Battles HOA Bullies with Justice and Four-Wheel Drive." The story featured footage from our HOA meeting, a brief interview with Leah, and a shot of the Jeep parked out front with a giant red bow on top. From there, things took off. We started getting calls from reporters, community blogs, and even a podcast that focused on HOA reform across the country. Leah did 2 interviews in a week, sharing her story and encouraging homeowners to read their HOA agreements line by line, challenge unlawful amendments, and never surrender to someone just because they carry a clipboard. She didn't rant. She didn't gloat. She spoke plainly, logically, and with quiet fire. That made her message even more powerful. Karen, on the other hand, tried to rewrite her role in the saga. An anonymous letter showed up in several neighbors' mailboxes, typed in all caps with phrases like, "They're lying for publicity," and "I was trying to protect the community." One neighbor said she saw Karen late at night slipping envelopes into mail slots while wearing sunglasses and a hoodie. Nobody took her seriously anymore. Her credibility had been demolished by her own actions. She had become a neighborhood cautionary tale, someone people referenced when they talked about what happens when power goes unchecked. Meanwhile, the HOA's culture continued to evolve. Leah implemented a resident suggestion box, then formed a rotating committee of volunteers to help review neighborhood proposals. People were now participating in ways they hadn't dared before. Brent, the guy with the towed Bronco, helped organize a weekend car meet in the cul-de-sac, just a friendly event to showcase some of the unique vehicles residents owned. Nobody batted an eye at decals or tire size. Instead, kids climbed inside Jeeps, dads compared engine mods, and even some of the older folks came out with lawn chairs just to enjoy the scene. One of the most touching moments came when Mrs. Whitaker, an 82-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, approached Leah with tears in her eyes. She told her how Karen had once threatened to fine her for letting her granddaughter draw chalk art on the sidewalk. "I scrubbed it off that same night," she said. "I didn't want to be a problem. But I hated that I had to erase her joy." Leah hugged her and promised her she would never have to erase joy again. Then came the cherry on top. At our next dealership promotional event, we decided to unveil a special edition Jeep as a tongue-in-cheek tribute to everything that had unfolded. It was an off-road beast with matte black paint, custom mud tires, a subtle Justice Edition logo near the bumper, and a decal that read, "Not for Karen use." We posted a teaser online, expecting a few laughs. Instead, it went mini-viral. Hundreds of people commented, shared their own HOA horror stories, and asked how they could get the edition for themselves. It didn't take long for corporate to approve a limited run, and just like that, what started as a suburban battle turned into a regional product line. But for all the jokes, the headlines, and the campaign success, the best moment came quietly, one night after dinner. Leah and I were sitting in the driveway, watching the sunset paint the sky in burnt orange and dusty purple. The Jeep was parked beside us, the same one Karen had tried to drag away like it was a stray animal. I looked at Leah and said, "Do you think she ever understood what she was actually trying to take from us?" Leah didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, she thought it was about control. But it was about respect. And when you try to take someone's dignity and wrap it in rules, you don't just lose the battle, you lose your place at the table. A few nights later, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. There was no announcement, no farewell, no sign of her ever setting foot outside. Just a team of movers who loaded up furniture, boxed frames, and carefully rolled up what looked like a very expensive rug. By morning, the house was empty. A for sale sign went up within the week. The neighborhood exhaled. And nobody missed her. In her place, peace bloomed. Not the fake kind you get from submission, but the earned kind that grows when people work together instead of under fear. The kind that fills driveways with laughter and chalk art and Jeeps that don't need permission to exist. The kind that doesn't tremble at a notice or a threat, because it remembers what it took to get here, and who stood up when it mattered. We never intended to become symbols of resistance. We were just a couple trying to enjoy our driveway. But Karen's mistake was assuming we'd fold like everyone else. She didn't realize we weren't just parked there. We were planted. And no one, no matter how many policies they twisted, could ever uproot us again. Justice wasn't just the name of a Jeep. It was the legacy we left behind, one tire mark at a time.